When you get in the air, flying becomes pretty simple because there are only two rules of safe flying in the air. Rule number one is keep it under control. And rule number two is don't hit anything. Everything else is just an elaboration of these two simple rules. That's all there is to it, folks. It's that simple. Well, if it's all that simple, why do pilots come to grief? Well, the reason is because they get so busy following rule number one, keep it under control, that they don't have time to follow rule number two, don't hit anything. Now, you might think that's pretty silly. After all, the consequences of violating either one of these rules is catastrophe. So why would pilots neglect one critical rule for another? Well, that's because there are really only two categories that rules can fall into. The first category is those things that are important versus not important. Now, when something is important, there are big consequences if you don't do it. Now, the second category that rules can fall into is urgent versus not urgent. Now, when something is urgent, not only do you have to do it, but you have to do it now. Now, the reason rule number two gets neglected is because rule number one, keep it under control, is both important, there are big consequences if you don't do it, and it's also urgent. You have to do it now. So rule number one falls in both of these categories. Now, on the other hand, in most cases, rule number two, don't hit anything, is merely important, but it's not urgent. Now, what does rule number one, keeping under control, involve? Well, it means basic control of the airplane, keeping the pointy side forward and the dirty side down, as they say. It also means putting the airplane where you want it, being at the proper altitude and the proper heading at the proper speed. Now, for a lot of us pilots, that can be pretty time-consuming and it can take all of our attention. And rule number one is urgent. Keeping it under control is always urgent because you can never afford to lose control. It's also pretty important. Now, rule number two, don't hit anything, is actually a lot more complicated than it sounds. First of all, it means knowing where you are, where the obstacles are, and how high above the terrain you are. It also means navigating so you don't get lost and run out of fuel before you get near an airport. And it means managing your fuel and managing your flight planning so that everything comes out at the right time. Now, all of this is very important, but it doesn't really become urgent until you run the risk of running out of fuel and making an off-airport landing. Or in really bad weather, you're flying so low to stay out of the clouds, you're getting close to hitting the terrain. But rest assured, neglect number two long enough, and this rule does become urgent. Now, the problem is that sadly, pilots often neglect rule number two when they get busy. In fact, they can get so busy they completely lose track of where they are. What is it they get so busy doing? Well, of course, like I said, following rule number one, keeping it under control. You see, the workload on a flight isn't even. Sometimes there isn't much to do. In fact, you can get lulled by the peace and beauty of flying. But at other times, there's far too much to do. Air traffic control can keep you so busy on the radio and looking out for other traffic that you really don't have much time for anything else. In fact, they seem to have an uncanny way of knowing when you're really busy. And they give you a radio call right at that exact moment. Now, you have no way of controlling when you'll get a radio call. So how do you keep from becoming so busy that you forget rule number two? Well, the answer is to work ahead on rule number two when rule number one doesn't take all of your attention. A lot of people call this by the fancy name of cockpit resource management. Now, this makes rule number two easier to follow when rule number one demands more of your attention. Now, the best place to start working on rule number two is on the ground before you take off. And this is called flight planning. It consists of figuring out how far you'll be flying and the effect of the wind on your flight. Now, with this information, you can figure out in advance how much fuel to carry so that your engine keeps running during the entire flight. Another trick is, after you get airborne, as soon as you can, verify your ground speed and recalculate your fuel reserves. And many pilots recheck the weather for their destination and their alternates as soon as they get airborne. All of this is called fuel management. Now, when you're flying cross country, you can get ahead with your navigation to make sure that you know where you are. You write down the times when you pass over each checkpoint, and that way you know where you were at a particular time. Now, another thing that you can do in the air that will help you with rule number 2 is to follow the 3 habits of safe flying. Habit number 1 is always have an alternative. In other words, keep an alternate course of action in mind in case your original plans don't work out. Now, when people think about maintaining an alternative, they're generally thinking about fuel. It's very important to keep track of your fuel status. Always have enough fuel to go somewhere else. There have been many famous airline crashes that came about because the pilots mismanaged their fuel. The good news about a Skyhawk is that it can hold plenty of fuel, so there's never any reason to get low on fuel in a Skyhawk. Now, another thing to keep in mind when you're always maintaining an alternative is to stay aware of weather trends. For instance, the wind could pick up at the airport where you were going to land. Or if it's a coastal airport, fog could move into the airport. Now, always having an alternative will mean that you will have a way out no matter what the weather does. Now, another reason for always keeping an alternative is that there could be a disabled airplane on the runway when you arrive at your intended airport. Well, if you've already worked out an alternative, you'll know exactly what to do and where to go in that case. Now, habit number 2 is when things change, change your plan. You know, the number 1 cause of fatal accidents in cross-country flying and general aviation airplanes is continued VFR flight into worsening weather conditions. Now, pilots don't deliberately take off and fly in weather that they know will kill them. What happens is the weather changes when they're flying en route, but they just keep right on going as if the weather were still good. Now, many pilots will do the same thing with mechanical problems, electrical problems, radio problems, or a rough engine. They just keep on going as if everything were working perfectly. Well, if you get into worsening weather or have a mechanical problem with your airplane, find an airport and land now. In other words, when things change, don't just keep on going. Change your plan. Now, habit number 3 is always think through the consequences. Preferably just before you do something instead of just afterwards. So if you have an unexpected situation come up, such as a change in the weather or a disabled aircraft on your intended runway, just slow down. Keep your airplane under control, react calmly, and think about the situation and think about the consequences. Then act deliberately and carefully. Remember, as we said before, there's no situation so bad that you can't make it worse by rushing.